Hello everybody, it's great to have you here. I am very excited to show you 20 interesting things, talk about them a little bit, and list them on eBay while you watch. If you're a level 2 or level 3 member of my channel, that is. And thank you folks for making this video possible. You get early access to this, and then everybody else gets to see it, and it's because you made it possible with your membership contributions, so we really appreciate that. We do a lot of extra work to put these on, but we really enjoy going to a deeper dive on some of these interesting items, and we try to bring a range of things from, we have antiques from the 1830s all the way up to things made in the 1980s in tonight's episode. So let's take a look at what we're putting on eBay right now. We like to try to do some buy it now. Some things need a little bit more time in the marketplace to find their correct value, so we've got a combination of both today. And the first item I'm going to show you is actually a Fenton piece. We've got 3 Fenton pieces tonight, and that's because we've come into a nice collection of Fenton again. And about a year ago, we were in Marietta doing the Fenton convention and having so much fun. And so it was really exciting for me to find some more really interesting pieces, including this, which is part of the Natural Animals line. Fenton, of course, is well known for doing animal figurines. I was friends with Debbie and Randy Coe, who were big Fenton collectors and headed a big Fenton organization in the Northwest, and they kept telling the Fentons, please make more animals. It's something our daughter is interested in, and that's how we're getting her to start collecting. And so they really listened to that and realized that the animals could be a big success for them, added a lot to the line, and then their decorators get credit because the decorators were the ones who said, hey, you know what, if we made some of them in colors that were not Burmese and these fanciful colors that are not natural, and did a few of them more like the natural colors, wouldn't it be interesting to decorate those and see how they came out? And it came out really well, and a lot of people preferred the natural animals. So this is a good example of one. This is the fox, and you can see a little better against the white what the true color is. It's more of a ruddy cinnamon almost, and he was painted by D. Frederick. D. Frederick was one of the few men who ever worked as a decorator at Fenton. It is typical in glass and pottery decorating that the decorators are women, generally who have some sort of art training. But in this case, Mr. Frederick came to work for Fenton, and he was a good decorator, and so they let him, the better decorators were the ones who got to do this sort of thing because it took a little bit more skill. And again, let's put that behind so you see the true color. I think he's very handsome, and he is going to start at $39. We do have a buy it now on him because he's something that I could ship from the road if somebody wants him right away. Otherwise, we'll see where he goes over 10 days. One of the reasons that we do these is partly to experiment and see where these things are selling in the market in an open marketplace at the present time. And that's why we do auctions. I know a lot of people are down on eBay auctions. I admit that having a bigger following these days probably helps my auctions, but honestly, I've always done pretty well with them. You just really have to try to find things that are a little different. If you're listing something and there's 300 of them, you're just going to get lost in the shuffle. The next item I have to show you, this one is fairly recent edition, and we'll talk about why that is, and then we're going to show you another one later that is quite old. This is a whole plate or flat plate camera, a platform camera from Japan. I'm just going to pull it out enough for you to see the bellows and everything, but it does work, and actually it's in its original box. I don't think it's ever been used. It's by a company called Toco, and you can see the flat plate in the bottom here. The idea is this is hearkening back to old school photography, the first couple of generations where they had to use plate cameras and then print the items carte de vistas, or in the early days with the wet process, tintypes and daguerreotypes, and this would have been the style of camera they used back then. This one was done probably in the 1980s or 90s as a thing for collectors to use, because about the time that digital photography really took off, there was a real discussion in the art world as to, is digital photography going to be permanent? Because at first they had trouble fixing things so they wouldn't fade away. Is it going to have the same art capacity? Well, yes, it does, in that there's so many great things that they have invented now in digital photography. But there is still a feel to the old ways of doing things, and there are a group of camera folks and photographers who really want to use these in the manner they were done originally. And one nice thing about these is, if you're making contact negatives, you can do that on a plate very easily using a light bulb and not have to have a bunch of developer and emulsifier to do it. So I know there's a collector market for these. Like I said, at the very end, we're going to show you an old version of the same thing, or older version, and it will have a whole bunch of stuff that goes with it. And so we figured we would put these out for our camera buffs to see. This next piece was cute and clever and way ahead of its time, and I'll nicely say was the inspiration to a much more famous version of something like this that came almost 40 years later. This is from the 1939 World's Fair in New York. They had the permission to put New York World's Fair, and they've got the fair logo initials there. So they had permission to do this, and that means that it would have been for sale at the fair as well. It's a very cute piece. This is supposed to be a New Yorker's idea of the United States. And it's at the same time both a bit of hubris and also a bit of naivete, because this is just before World War II. At this point, if you lived in New York, there was a very good possibility you had never left New York City in your entire lifetime. Most people didn't have cars. Maybe you got over to Palisades Park in New Jersey, and the joke of this is that it's showing that New Yorkers think that New York is this giant thing that is the size of its own nation, which it boasts about there, that it is the center of American commerce, and that New Yorkers really don't have much thought or regard to anything else outside of New York. It's got great Art Deco graphics around the edges. Comic maps were a big thing in the 1930s anyway, and this one just is really fun because you see the proportions. New York is gigantic. We know there's upstate New York. We know there's New England. Let the New Yorkers speak. And one says, my family moved out west to Wilmington, Delaware. And another says, oh yes, he's on the marathon swim from Los Angeles to Hawaii. You see Oregon is above Washington, and Montana's above that, somewhere up in the middle of Canada. The idea is that New Yorkers really don't have much of a sense of much of anything out of New York, except Florida, which we go to on vacation. So Florida's pretty big too. It was done by a fellow, and his name is here, called David K. Wallingford. I have not found that he did any other things that were of note or that are known to collectors, but this certainly is a cool thing. And when I said it inspired something else, in 1976, the New Yorker came out with a cover called A View from 9th Street that was very, very famous. And the view from 9th Street is basically, we can see all the way across Brooklyn and Manhattan, and oh yeah, then there's like some Indians and the Pacific Ocean's out there somewhere. It's the same kind of idea that New Yorkers are not really aware of things outside of New York, which by then probably wasn't so true, but it was funny and received well and very famous in the 1970s. And I am absolutely certain that the fellow who did it saw this and came up with the idea. So there's nothing really new under the sun, and this is not new either. It's from 1939, and the condition is good. That yellowish color is the buff color of the piece, so it's not like it's yellowed in some damaged way. It's just the way it was presented, and I think someone will get a big kick out of it. We're just starting it at $19.99, and we're going to see where it goes. They don't come up very often. Luke, I am your nightlight. Okay, well, I'm no James Earl Jones, but James Earl Jones is pretty amazing, by the way. Yes, he is the voice of Darth Vader, that rich, resonant voice of his. He's 92 years old. He's still doing voiceovers, and he's been an amazing actor for gosh, longer than I've been alive. And so Darth Vader, probably the best known villain in the Western world. And because of that, I suspect some little kid was presented this nightlight when Return of the Jedi, part of the original trilogy, came out, and said, I don't want to look at Darth Vader at night, that's scary. And so it never came off of this card, which I think is really fun. And they did these of Yoda and some of the other characters as well. They don't sell for a ton, but they are original to the first era. And that's important because the things made in the era of the first 3 movies, by and large, I know there's collector's editions and there's a lot of interest in the newer stuff because there's younger people and there's people who just love the franchise and will collect anything. But the OG stuff is really the stuff that typically sells for the most. Now, this is not terribly expensive. It's just going up at $9.99 and a buy it now of $15 because that's a fair price for these. But I thought it was so much fun to show. I do have some other Star Wars stuff I'm going to be bringing to the shows. This next piece was a real surprise to me when I found it because I had honestly never heard of this glass company, didn't realize how much really great art glass they made. And part of the reason for that is that it was founded in Malta. Yes, the tiny island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean is where Medina Glass is from. Medina, M-D-I-N-A, is a town in Malta. It's up in the hills and it's where the glass blowing is done. And the signature is on the bottom here. Hopefully I can get that to where you can see it. Yeah, you can get a little of it there. This is an earlier mark. The later Medina was more, the etch mark is more of a slanted with a wider tool so it's easier to see, which was deliberate. But here is the original. This was done from 1968 to probably some point in the 80s when the original founders sold off. The original founders were 2 guys from England by the name of Michael Harris and Eric Dobson, and they met each other at the Royal College of Art, graduated, and that was right in 1968 when the Maltese were trying to woo English investment. Malta was no longer, after 1964, a colony of England, and it was its own independent country. And because of that, they were looking for investment from the English. And these guys said, hey, there's no glass blowing there. Let's set up a glass making factory. And they loved doing modern designs. This is something that they call random strapping. I'm going to hold it a little closer so you can really see the color. It's a green overlay, and it is a really hot orange color in the glass. And it honestly shows better in the picture than it does here because I have such a dark room that I'm working in tonight. So we'll hold this behind it so you get a little bit of the color. I really like the random strapping. That's actually a collector name. This is actually a line that Medina never really named. Most of their lines have a name. They did other overlays like this as well, but the random patterns I think are just a lot of fun. It's big, it's showy, it's colorful, it looks great with sunlight coming through it. So I think other art glass collectors are going to be as excited about it as I was when I found it. It's nice to have a new discovery in art glass to look for. That one is going to start at $49, and we are just going to see what the market is for something different that most people have never seen. I have been running into a lot of restaurant ware lately, and I'm noticing that people are interested in it. I got a bunch of mugs, and I've already had a couple of emails asking how much for the collection. So I know there's collectors out there again, and this piece is particularly interesting because of where it's from and its connection. This is a sugar bowl with a lid, and this is, if you see the very cute little bird there, well, that is transferware, and it is a very pretty pheasant with a long tail, and it says Golden Pheasant Cleveland O, back when O was Ohio, because Ohio was the first O state, so they just said O. Eventually Oregon came along, and then the zip codes came along, and that all changed. But back then, in the 1930s, when this was made, this would have been what the mark was, and it is by a company called Lamberton China. Lamberton China was only in business till 1955, but their big specialty was restaurant ware. We have another piece of Lamberton that we're going to be showing later that has a railroad connection. But the connection on this one is a little more interesting than it might seem just for the graphics, although it is a cute piece, because the Golden Pheasant Chinese restaurant at 944 Prospect Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, became a place in the late 1920s where jazz bands started to play. The Austin Wiley Orchestra played there, and that included Artie Shaw. That was one of his first bands. And in the early 1930s, Red Nichols and his band actually did nationally broadcast shows from the Golden Pheasant in Cleveland. So it was a very famous place in its time, and Cleveland was a major city. They even had a regional fair similar to a World's Fair in the 1930s, and it was booming. And so the big bands played there a lot, and this place was an important part of their circuit. So I'm really excited to have it because it has this connection to the jazz era and big bands and swing, all of which are personal peccadillos of mine. I like that kind of music a lot. And the fact that this little piece has survived, well, I'm not sure who went there and saw Artie Shaw and then said, oh, I'm going to put this in my purse and take it with me. I'd like to think that actually these things were deaccessioned when the Golden Pheasant went away. But in any event, it's a cute little piece. It's going to start very, very cheaply. We are starting this at, believe it or not, $4.99, and we're just going to let the market take it to where it should be. I think the interest is going to be more from jazz aficionados, perhaps, than restaurant collectors, but you never know, because the pheasant is cute, and it could be just somebody in Cleveland wants it because of the connection there as well. That's part of what's fun about collecting restaurant ware, besides the fact that it's really durable and it can outlast your kids and clumsiness like we all suffer from sometimes a lot better than a fine china plate could. It also is fun because the graphics are so interesting. They cover all sorts of places from all over the country, and I just think it's neat stuff. So I'm glad to bring this out, and we'll see who our Clevelanders or our jazz fans or our restaurant ware fans are. The next piece we have on tap is someone very famous. I've had a little bit of luck lately coming up with autographs that are real from stars who are really popular, and this is one whose fame has definitely outlasted her era, and that is Ingrid Bergman. And this is 1945. Look how young and lovely she looks there. And there's the signature to Jimmy Cottrell, Ingrid Bergman, 1945, and you can tell it's a real fan print because it's got the name of the studio right under the I in her name. Ingrid Bergman was Swedish, and she first acted in Sweden, but she also knew 5 different languages, and she acted in all of them. It's really pretty amazing, the breadth of her talent. She was more than just a woman who could play a sad Scandinavian woman. She was very versatile and did a lot of things, and really brought this interesting combination of sort of European aloofness with a real way of getting soulful expression out. I mean, there's a reason that she is so spoken of amongst film circles, talked about in film schools, because she really had something special. And the autographs by her are pretty special too. This one is from the Bells of St. Mary's. This is when she won her second Oscar in 1945, playing across from Bing Crosby, who is the friar, and they're both trying to save their parochial school, but they have very different ideas about how to do it. Of course, the year before that she won her first Oscar for, she won 3 in her career and a whole bunch of other awards. The first one was the year before for the film Gaslight. Gaslight was such an influential film, with Charles Boyer trying to make her think that she was insane, that the term gaslighting has actually become a term used in psychological circles to indicate that someone is being manipulated into believing that what they're seeing is not real and what they believe is true is not true. And so gaslighting is something that you've probably heard of, and that came from that movie. Ingrid is a fairly hard autograph to find on a piece that really relates to her movie memorabilia, and these seem to go pretty well, as much as $150 to $200. So I'm curious to see how this will do online. We are actually just going to start it and let it go and see what happens. So it's going to start at a pretty low price, and we'll see what the market has to say about it. Yes, I'm still here in the inky blackness, and with me I have this. This is a Fenton 100th anniversary landmarks piece, and this landmark is a beach scene. So this is a wonderful piece of Burmese that obviously glows in the dark, and you can still see the designs. I think that's what's so neat about these painted Fenton pieces, is if you've got a bunch of the sort of transparent glass that glows under a black light with the uranium in it, well, having the design come out is really fun, and it kind of breaks up a collection of just solid green. Now, Burmese in this peach blow to yellow color is something that is very, very much associated with Fenton, but it goes way back. In earlier times, the Mount Washington Glass Company, Frederick Shirley was their chemist, designer. He was amazing, and he actually was the one who came up with this color back in around the 1870s, and it was a huge hit back then. Unfortunately, they were still hand blowing glass back then, and uranium and blowing glass was a bad combination, so there was a lot of industrial disease amongst the people who made this back then. Fortunately, we learned about that, and by the time Fenton was doing these, no more of that kind of problem. But if you are ever in Wheaton, New Jersey and have a chance to see the Glass Museum there, they have an incredible display of early Mount Washington Burmese, and you will enjoy it if you like this sort of thing. I really enjoy this piece because I, of course, am a beach guy, but also just because it's so unusual. It's got the mark on the bottom. This is one of the ones that was family approved, so it's got Shelley Fenton on it and then the hand painting on the bottom, and this is the Landmark Collection 1905 to 2005. It does, I think, have the paper tag for the 100th anniversary in there somewhere. Yes, I'm pretty sure I just saw it swishing around in there. So we still have it with it. It's a great piece. I've not seen this piece before. I can't imagine they did a whole lot of these. I have to admit, I was tempted to wait until I went to Florida to sell it because it's such a great Floridian style of scene. But that's a few months from now, and it's too nice a piece to have sit on a shelf that long. At least my shelf. It needs to go to someone else's shelf. So we're putting this out, and we're going to start this I think around $49.99, and just see what the market is. It should sell for as much as $175, so we'll see how that does, but I think it's a beautiful piece. This next piece is for someone who's sassy. At least that's what the commercial said. This is an apron for Drink Wink. And Wink was a soda that came out in 1965. It was part of the Canada Dry line, advertised to young people. Drink Wink, it's a grapefruit soda, it's sassy. They sent around trucks with giant bottles on them to introduce the product, and they would give out free drinks of Wink, and they'd have the Wink girl, who was almost always redheaded and sassy and fun. And the commercials all had this little jingle about Wink being very sassy. So that is the term. It's small because it was made for younger people, because that was the audience then. So they figured that you didn't need it to be too big, but they gave you an ample amount so you could put this around up to probably a 40 or 45 inch waist as well. It's in great condition. I don't think it was used much, if at all. It's got a little bit of stain that I want to point out, in all fairness. I just like to disclose any condition stuff. A little tiny bit of yellowness right there, and a little bit of soiling on the one piece here. I haven't tried to wash it. I suspect it would come out. I leave those things to people who are better with fabrics than I am. So it's a cute piece with an interesting history. And Wink the Sassy one jingle ran for several years. And that's what inspired this bit of sexy 60s fashion. So I think it's cute. I think someone else will think it's cute. It'll start at $9.99 and the buy it now of $20, which I think is about right. I don't really see much Wink stuff around anymore. I do know that they gave out some pretty cool premiums, including Peter Max prints. You may have seen me take these to some shows in Florida. I almost sold them at the show in Portland, but they're a very specific thing for a very specific collector. And that is one thing that eBay is good for, is finding things that have a very specific, narrow collecting market These are Napoleon Capo di Monte. I know a lot of us who are used to dealing with 20th century Capo di Monte are used to seeing sort of hastily painted multicolored cherubs and big flowers, but this mark here is the old mark from starting around the 1830s, and I think this mark was used for about 60 years. So these are 19th century. They have amazing applied detail, and they definitely fall into just like a genre painting. This is definitely a genre piece of porcelain because it's essentially a very idealized Victorian idea of what these people are doing. It's supposed to be, you know, very fun and frilly and over the top and really high design. They had a reputation for being, as hard-paste porcelain, a little bit more fine and refined than even Meissen when they first came out. And these definitely are a good example. The condition is good overall. I did see one, I believe there is a break of a flower petal here. So for full disclosure, I made a point of that in the listing, and I tried to show lots of pictures so you can look over and see if you see something missing that my eye missed, but I believe that's the only point of damage, and it's rather small. These are going to have a reserve on them because they are a special thing that we do not see very often. I haven't handled a lot of these in my career because they just don't come up very often. They stay in collection. I mentioned that I had another Lamberton China piece because restaurant ware really was their specialty, and they made a good business out of it through the Depression years and well into the mid-50s, and then restaurants, well, things started to gravitate towards fast food and throwaway stuff, and that was kind of the end of it. But this piece was done in 1927 for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and it shows the very famous Wagner Bridge that they built at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad actually brought the troops in to put down the rebellion at Harper's Ferry started by John Brown shortly before the Civil War. And they had a line that went to Harper's Ferry and then crossed into what was Virginia, not West Virginia at the time. In fact, the B&O Railroad had a little bit to do with the fact that West Virginia split off from Virginia and joined the North in the middle of the war, because so many of the lines ran through that part of Virginia, and that part of the state of Virginia stuck up way into the Appalachians, where there was not plantation culture and there was not the interest in slave owning, and so they split off and joined the North, in part so that the Union could actually get supplies across without having to go through Virginia to do it. On the back, we see the mark here. This is the Centennial, 1827 to 1927. You see the Lamberton mark down at the bottom there. This appears to be an original edition. In the 1970s, the Chessie system, which this became part of, did their 150th anniversary version of this, but it has a different mark on the back because it was a different railroad by then. It shows scenes all around the railroad. B&O was very, very important. It was the first passenger railway in the United States, and it started in 1827 when there was practically no other railroad in the area. They actually dragged things by horses at first until they decided that maybe this new steam locomotive was going to be the thing. And it was indeed the thing. And you could go 18 miles an hour over this bridge. I'm so used to seeing the 150th anniversary editions that I was surprised to pick this up and see that it was an old Lamberton piece. And they're pretty collectible with railroad collectors. It should sell for around $50. We're going to start it at less than half of that. This next item is something that I discovered a little something about that I find very amusing and have shared a few times lately, and I wanted to share it by showing you this. It's very sweet. It's very cute. It's a utensil crock, and this is the Noah's Ark pattern, and these were made by Louisville Stoneware. Now, Louisville Stoneware is still in business, and Noah's Ark is one of the lines that they still make, but a lot of these pieces are discontinued, and so you don't see all of the pieces in the line anymore. The other thing about it is it's colorful, it's whimsical, it's really sweet, and there are two of everything. And you notice there are two lions, and they both have manes. Now, lionesses only grow manes if they are kept in captivity long enough to affect their hormones in a way that causes them to masculinize. I don't think Noah had that in mind when he set off on the ark. So are those two male lions, and how did they get on board together? I just find that very quizzical and amusing, and I just noticed it recently. I've seen these pieces for years, and it just dawned on me. And I think what it was when they did the design, they're like, well, it's two identical of every animal, so two lions. Lions look good with manes. So, But it's also just a very sweet piece. And I know that Dom from Primetime Treasure Hunter is a Noah's Ark collector. I don't know if he has any of these pieces in his collection. Louisville Stoneware is a great outfit. They mostly just sell retail around Kentucky now, although you can special order. But they really switched from wholesale to retail about the time that this line was really becoming popular, so they're harder to find now. But there are collectors all over the country, even though 80% of their sales are to people right in the Louisville area. A lot of those people are visiting and they take it home with them. I have a friend in Washington State who has an entire set of their Bachelor button, which is a very cute line, and she loves it because it's blue on gray and it matches all of her Scandinavian items. So a lot of different collectors for Louisville Stoneware around the country. They have been in business since 1815 in one guise or another, and can make an argument that they may be the longest lived pottery company in America at this point. That one is just going to start at $19, and we're going to have fun with it and see where it goes. I like Olympic collectibles. Olympic collectibles can be very valuable. These two are not particularly, but they are interesting because they have one thing in common, even though these Olympics took place 20 years apart. And that is, both of these Olympics, in one way or another, ultimately suffered from cancel culture in a form. We'll show you the first one. This one is from Squaw Valley, and it's got a tiny chip at the top. You can see that in the reflection there. I want to be fair about condition. And it's a little worn where it says Winter Olympics 1960, but it's got the Native American woman and a little girl skiing down a ski slope, which is a little bit of cultural appropriation, but Squaw Valley was brand new. In fact, when the Olympics were given in 1956, Squaw Valley was a one lift, ski tow rope, tiny little resort with no facilities whatsoever. And the Olympic Committee said, we will grant you this, but within 1 year, you have to start building a big resort there for the Olympics, or we will pull this and we will give it to Innsbruck, Austria. So they got started right away. They got $1 million from the state of California. Ultimately, $80 million, which was a lot of money at that time, was spent to make the Squaw Valley Olympics happen. What's the cancel part of this? Well, in the past few years, this place has been renamed Olympic Valley because the term squaw is actually a very vulgar term to Native Americans referring to women's anatomy, and has been deemed offensive, and so we don't use that term in polite company anymore. And that's why this has that cancellation aspect to it. In the case of the 1980 Summer Games, well, we just canceled our participation completely because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And not only did we drop out of the Olympics, but so did 65 other countries. So the Moscow Olympics, which were the first held in an Eastern Bloc country, went on with a lot fewer of the countries of the world involved. There was a lot of controversy over that at the time, whether that was a good response or an appropriate response or fair to the athletes. But unfortunately, the Olympics have been tied up in politics for a long time now. Here's the back of it. It's in great shape, and it's one of the few things that was issued that says USA Moscow, because they were just starting to put out various collectible items for the 1980 Olympics. In February of 1980, when Jimmy Carter petitioned for the Olympics, the USA Olympics, to boycott, and they agreed. So there's not a whole lot of stuff pertaining to the USA from the 1980 Olympics. So the combination of these two I thought would just be fun for some Olympics collector, and we are starting these at only $4.99 for the pair. I'm bringing some lunchboxes to the fall shows, but I picked one out to put online because it's a little scarcer than the others that I had, and I think it needs to find a bigger audience because it's from a TV show that was very popular in its time, but a little obscure to people now, unless they were fans back in the day or had this lunchbox. This is Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and it starred Richard Basehart as Captain Nelson. And Captain Nelson on the back here is telling him, oh my goodness, there's a huge squid coming after the craft. The fellow who played Captain Nelson, by the way, was also Wilton Knight, Knight Rider's father in the pilot episode, and he dies in that episode. So it was a short gig, but he did reappear on television. The condition overall is pretty good, and this is a fairly scarce lunchbox because by the time this came out, even though this was the longest running continuing character sort of sci-fi type television show in the 1960s, they didn't think to put a lunchbox out until 1967, and the show went off the air in 1968. So the graphics are really fun, really vivid, and fortunately this one's in reasonable condition. Now lunchboxes get worn. They get worn on the high points. You can see that. They occasionally get little dents. I remember people would club each other over the head with them as children, such delightful children we were. And then you open up. There is no thermos, but it's not rusted. It's not dented. It doesn't have any huge scrapes. It's not missing a bunch of paint. Somebody didn't write their name in ink pen on it. Those are all very good things because this particular lunchbox, even in this condition, can sell for as much as $135 to $150. And in perfect condition with a thermos, they can be twice that. This one's pretty hard to find. Our next guy is also a 1960s television character, but he has never quit acting because he wasn't real to begin with. Is that intriguing enough? Well, it is Fred Flintstone. So he's real enough to me, and he's certainly real as this guy. This is a rubber face from when the show was just about to come out. So this is really early, and it's got the tag on it for the Flintstones, Hanna-Barbera Productions, 1961, which is the year that this came out on television. And the Flintstones were a brainchild of Hanna-Barbera. And just like Walt Disney when he put out Snow White as a full-length motion picture, everyone said the Flintstones will never work. This is a huge gamble. They only got green-lighted to do it because they had won 7 Academy Awards in the 1940s and 50s for Tom and Jerry. And so they had a little bit of cachet. And so the network said, okay, we'll let you try to make an animated show in primetime if you think people will watch it. So Hanna-Barbera knew they had to have something that related to people. So even though this cave dweller is from ancient bedrock, long millions of years ago, actually it's based more or less on The Honeymooners, which was based on the Bickersons radio show, which is so fun with Don Amici. That's a very funny radio show. If you ever find an old tape of it, I suggest that you give it a listen. The idea was basically that you have this sort of hot-headed husband and a long-suffering wife and friends and neighbors, and they get into minor scrapes and basically live like 20th century people, except they live in houses made of stone and cars that you have to push with your feet. I remember one episode that Wilma wants to redo the house in Cave Dweller Modern. So it definitely has a very 60s feel, but he's a lot of fun. He's got all his stuff. He's got so many times you see the particularly the felt. The tie's missing, it's chewed, it's super dirty. This one's in pretty good shape overall, just a little bit of soiling and minor wear. So I think he should do well. They typically sell $40 to $50. I'm expecting that this one will probably do the same, but we're going to start it at half that and see how it goes. I like to do a combination of more expensive and less expensive items when I do these videos because I like to appeal to a lot of different collectors, but I also like sharing information about all sorts of different things. And in this case, we have 2 very cute 1930s silhouettes. And these are a little bit different. Now, they definitely follow the silhouette theme. They are quarters and dancers and couples in pairs. But these have a colored background, which is rather unusual, and they are mirrored. I'm not sure how I can get that to show. There we go. Now you see the mirroring. Yeah, you can see my keyboard in it. So they're a little bit different than they usually are. And that's why I thought these were interesting, and that's why I'm curious to see how they'll do online. The silhouettes were such a fad in the 1930s and 40s. The 1920s was when we saw a lot of development of mottos that hung on the wall. Buzz a Motto and some other novelty companies, and an advertising place in Iowa, Newton Advertising, started doing them. Well, by the 30s, it turned out that, well, they're inexpensive to give away, and a lot of these were given away as premiums from businesses. You'll see a thermometer with the business name, or a little calendar that pops out with the business name, because people just loved covering their walls with these, and they were not expensive. Silhouettes in the 1930s caught on in part because silhouettes from the 1870s made of paper cut from France started to be very collectible, and collectors started buying them and putting them in little frames very similar to these, which is why you see a lot of 1870s French paper silhouettes in frames that are much more like 1930s silhouettes that were made factory. So they're not anything that is really expensive, but they are very appealing, and there are a lot of collectors. And I walk into houses and they'll have like a stub wall between two rooms. It's not big enough for a piece of art, or maybe it has the thermometer sticking in the middle of the wall or something. And so they'll start arranging silhouettes and small pictures around to make a gallery wall and take away from that noise and have something fun on the wall. And I think those collections where there's a bunch together are just really fun. So hopefully this will go to somebody who enjoys them a lot and likes the color, because that is the selling point as far as I'm concerned. Again, they're going to start at just $9.99. I figure they're probably worth about $30 for the pair, which is the buy it now price. Now I have my third piece of Fenton and last piece for this flight, and it's a real showstopper. Fenton's decorators get a lot of credit for the firm going on as long as it did. They started with a woman named Louise Piper, and she came in and started hand painting, and she was very good at it. And then they said, wow, those are selling pretty well. We should add some more decorators. She ultimately ended up training virtually every decorator who worked at Fenton, which was over 100 in the end. And because of their work, as they got more and more skillful and did more and more intricate designs, you start seeing artware, and the artware is really what carried them for the last 15 or 20 years of their existence. And a lot of it was just developed and figured out by the decorators themselves. And I just think that they deserve a lot of tribute. This particular one is hand painted by Coot Shaw. You can see on the bottom there. And it's got the painted Fenton mark rather than the oval label. But what's really interesting to me about this is it has what's called glass frit. So all this glitter in the trees is actually glass sprayed on and applied, like an overshot or an overlay of glass. And that's what gives it texture. Now, you don't want to rub on it too hard, because you certainly could rub some of it off if you weren't careful. But it is fired into the glass. If you put the light down in the piece, you get a nice inside glow. If you put it on the front of the piece, the frit appears to be glittery purpley blue, which I think is really neat. So if you have this in a blacklight case, it really changes the piece in a really interesting way. And the fact that the frit changes color under the blacklight, I just find kind of fascinating. And so I thought this was a really interesting piece. And it is actually a rather scarce and hard to find piece. Again, should sell in the $195 range. We're going to start it a lot lower than that and let the market take it up to where it should be, whatever that may be. This next piece is something I had as a kid. I got this in 1980. I think it came in a Christmas stocking or something. And mine also had a grease pencil mark that said it was 98 cents when it was new. They sell for a bit more than 98 cents now. This is a Corgi Boat with Popeye in it, and you see Popeye and olive oil on the graphics. Corgi made in Northampton, UK at the time, still was producing in England. It says made in Great Britain on the back there. They made really good quality die-cast cars. and they were very realistic and a little, definitely larger than a Matchbox or that sort of toy, bigger than Hot Wheels, so a little more detail. As a kid, I had a friend who collected Corgi on the rare times we were able to go to the big city of Seattle, which was across the water and a ferry ride away, and go to the very special toy store that imported English toys, because Corgis were not really widespread. They were a little more expensive. Well, by 1980, Corgi was starting to suffer from all of the competition from offshore toy makers, and Popeye was also suffering as a franchise, but they knew there was going to be a Popeye movie, the one with Shelley Duvall and Robin Williams, that would come out shortly after this. So they started making Popeye-related items in an attempt to help both the Popeye franchise and the Corgi franchise to survive and thrive. The Popeye movie only did so-so, and the Corgi company only did so-so after this too. So this was an attempt to get more recognition for both, and I have to admit, I enjoyed it until I realized that it didn't actually float. It has little wheels on it. You're supposed to push it on the ground. Because the Corgi name is well respected amongst toy collectors today, this piece actually sells often for as high as $35 now. We're going to start it at $14.99 and see whether there is a customer out there who needs to replace theirs from childhood. And one more crazy thing that I remember from my childhood but never owned is our next item here. This guy is just fun, and I like fun and whimsy, and the market seems to like fun and whimsy again too. And boy, this guy's got it, because he is a Cyclops, and he is dressed like a caveman as well. I don't know what the connection between cavemen and Cyclops was, but this is one of these funky, funny, weird novelties from Japan from about 1970. And if you look on the bottom, it is by a company called NAPCO, National Potteries Company. Almost everybody today, including me until recently when I finally found an American-made NAPCO piece, was under the impression that all they did was import from Japan, but that's not true. They actually started in 1938, and they were one of the many companies trying to make things and replace the Japanese who had been cut out of the market due to our cutting off trade relations with them in 1937. And they did well enough and made enough little things, but as soon as the war was over, they realized the great potential there was to help restart the Japanese ceramics industry and act as a distributor for them, and that's exactly what they did. So all the pieces starting in about 1947 or so were made offshore. And this guy is just crazy, fun, cute silliness, but they're also pretty hard to find. First of all, I mean, he has a face that only a mother could love. And secondly, he has blue hair, and he's a little funky, and he's a little hippie-ish. So it's hard to explain to people now what parents' mindsets around the time this came out. My parents would not have allowed this in the house because it looked like a hippie and it was weird and it just freaked them out. And that's how a lot of parents were at that time. So things like this actually did not always end up in people's houses. They might have bought them, but they didn't necessarily get to keep them. So we just don't see a lot, and that's why this piece usually sells somewhere in the $50 range. Now we're going to just start it at $9.99. And this one will have a buy it now at $49, so you will have that option. If you are interested in him, you can click the link below and take a look. He's actually really pretty cool, and I don't think anyone ever put a quarter in him because this ceramic tended to chip pretty easily. So if these got used, you would expect to see paint chips and maybe little chips in the ceramic, which is very lightweight because it had to be shipped across the ocean. Now, the last item I have is a giant group of stuff in a very heavy 35-pound collection. And it will be something that will cost money to ship. Why am I selling it on eBay under those circumstances? Well, because it is another flat whole plate camera, and it is from the 1940s era, back when they were still using these in commercial photography and press photography and those sorts of things. So I'm going to show you the camera, and then I'm going to have to show you some of the other accessories so that you get an idea of what all comes with. The camera is this. This is the CalArt synchronized rangefinder camera. And here it is when you get it out and put the flash on. You can see that has a crack, and they're fairly easy to replace. It shouldn't really affect it too much, and I am disclosing that, so we'll see how much that affects the price. CalArt was one of the Graflex models, and you can see Graflex there. The case is also the original Graflex case, and Graflex was a good camera. But what's great is that there are a lot of pieces in this, and I'm not going to lie, I have not used a whole plate or flat plate camera, but from what I can tell, this has a lot of accessories that you would want. It has an additional lens here. It has probably 50 of the actual plate holders, and the accessories like the flash and this piece here are all Holland, as well as the metal piece on top that holds these accessories. And this tube actually has an on-off switch to add additional light. This would have strapped to the top of the camera as well. And you know, by the time you're holding the camera with all these accessories in it, this thing's pretty hefty. I mean, this is probably 8 or 10 pounds that you're holding, walking around taking pictures. And I look at all of those photographers in the old days, and a lot of them seem really small. You see those, you see the old movies where they're all holding these cameras and flash, 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 and you think, wow, that was actually a pretty big thing to hold steady. Of course, this one has an attachment on the bottom to put on a tripod if necessary. There's also a couple of lens extension rings. There's some filters. Doesn't seem right for this outfit, but there's even some 1957 film in here that somebody left. And of course the little push button thing so that you can do it remotely if it's on a tripod. So it seems to be a very complete kit, including some of the Ilford black and white film that you would use to take the pictures. And you can see on here it's 125 exposure, and these, obviously you can still get the film, that's why people are interested in this stuff. And there it is. I'm probably exposing it and ruining it, but it is from 1984, so probably you want to get a newer one anyway. A bunch more film holders in here, so it's got a lot of stuff. And that's what people are looking for when they're buying these, because they want as many of the original accessories. It comes in its original huge Graflex case. This is why overall this weighs about 35 pounds, so they are not cheap to ship. It might cost as much as $75 or $100 to get it to where it's going safely. And based on my recent experiences with the post office, I am definitely going to pack that one really, really well. So it's going to be a big, heavy package, but the people who collect those are really serious about them. These kits, when you see all this stuff in it, can sell for as much as $1,000. I would be happy if we got about half that for this set, so we're going to see. And I think that for the price that we're asking, there is a very good chance that that will go to somebody to use. It seems to be mainly people who are into art photography doing it now. And I'm just excited at the prospect that this thing, which was found in an attic in Seattle, could actually go and be used and make beautiful pictures again. It has been really fun to show you all of this stuff. Thank you so much for joining in. And if you want to follow these items and see how they do, just click the listings below, go to eBay, and you can follow it along. Even if the auctions are over, you'll be able to see the sold prices for some period of time. And so you'll get to learn some of what we learn about how these things do on eBay auctions here and now. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you again towards the end of the month with another flight of 20 items to put on eBay.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video, and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help, and we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.